everyone. Welcome to The Download, where we bring you discussion and analysis from a Catholic perspective. Today's Friday, July 28th, 2023. I'm Brad Eli, here with my two co-hosts, Simon Ray, Christine Niles. And joining us today in the fourth chair is Church Militant's managing editor, Rodney Pelletier. Hey, Rodney.
Hey.
This upcoming Monday, July 31st, is the feast of St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits. The Society of Jesus produced many great saints over the centuries, particularly in the first couple hundred years of its existence. But nowadays, unfortunately, the order is known for being very liberal, for tolerating liturgical abuse and heresy. In fact, among Catholics, Jesuits are often the butt of jokes. And why is that? What has changed about the order? That's one of several questions we hope to tackle in today's show. And, we're talking about jokes and everything like that. There was a actual historical incident that took place back in March 12th of 1622. It was when Ignatius of Loyola was canonized. He was canonized, he's the founder actually in 1534, he founded the Jesuits. He was canonized with Francis Xavier, who last said goodbye to him only 6 years after he founded the order. In 1540, they parted ways, never to see each other again. So those two are being canonized. They're both Spanish. And Teresa of Avila, who was founder of the Discalced Carmelites. And St. Isidore, the laborer, who was patron saint of Madrid, also Spanish. Now, along with them was canonized St. Philip Neri. And the people in Rome, being very provincial, this is written up several places, talked about this, that the people of Rome at the time said, oh, the Pope just canonized 4 Spaniards and a saint. And it's like, whoa, okay. Now, can you imagine in our day having like 5 big figures like that being canonized in the same? We get people getting canonized today, and you're like, I've never heard of this person, I've never heard of that person. But, heavy hitters like that, just like 5 in one shot, at a time like that. Well, things have changed quite a bit, and the Jesuits don't have a lot of candidates right now for up for canonization. Probably not that many will come right from this era. So.
Yeah, I think Doc, the important thing is, because obviously a lot of this episode is probably going to be us kind of dogging on the Jesuits with their liberal reputation and so forth, but I think that we do need to recognize that that there are many very saintly Jesuits, and not all of them are just like kind of from like back in the day before indoor plumbing and so forth like that. It's not just like back within that. For example, very recently within living memory, Father John Harden, S.J., Society of Jesus, and member of the Jesuits, Father John Harden, of course, very famous for his wonderful work, his wonderful talks and so forth, all of this wonderful stuff that he did, and very famously, you've brought this up, Brad, that he was actually kind of assigned by St. John Paul II to really catechize and evangelize the United States of America. So he came and did this. And of course, local boy in many ways, he was actually here in Metro Detroit for a long period. So obviously, very, very wonderful things within living memory of the Jesuits, but also as well, you've got, on the one hand, you've got somebody like Father Harden there, and you've got Father James Martin, who is also a Jesuit. And Father James Martin, of course, very, very troublesome. We've covered many of his troubling statements, some of the things he said. S.J., as he's known, because there is a number of people have speculated that Father Martin may be homosexual or suffer from same-sex attraction or something like this. He quite famously once said that his superiors had forbidden him to discuss that subject, but he seems to discuss everyone else's sexuality, but he didn't discuss his own. It's a question of, okay, well, why is it a secret? The only case in which it would seem to be a secret, I don't know, that would be if he was, in fact, homosexual in some way. But even if he himself is not homosexual, he has said gay couples should be allowed to kiss during the sign of peace at Mass, which is okay. That's not like a chaste kiss like 2 Frenchmen might give each other in that sort of sense. He supports transgenderism in children. Says gay teachers should not be fired from Catholic schools. A lot of those places are firing such teachers, getting rid of them. Says, this is the crazy one, says gays don't have to be chaste because they haven't received the teaching, meaning you don't have to follow something. It's not a sin to violate a moral teaching if you don't think it's a sin, which is kind of like, that's really not the point, Father? Again, so those are sort of the two examples there. But bear in mind, within living memory, of this situation. So this is not just the Jesuits, terrible people.
Yeah, Father James Martin is just an absolutely atrocious example of what the Jesuits should be. And I know there are all sorts of jokes about the Jesuits today because they've fallen so far. But truly, if you look at the founding of the Jesuits and what they were initially supposed to do, and the incredibly courageous, heroic example of the early Jesuits, it is tragic what has happened to them, because these were called the Pope's men. I mean, they were absolutely militant. They were courageous. They went to the furthest reaches of the world, to places where no one else had ever been before. St. Francis Xavier to the furthest reaches of Asia to evangelize these people. And he obtained thousands upon thousands of baptisms and conversions. And then you had the Jesuits during the time of Reformation in England. I mean, the most courageous men. It's amazing. So many who, under, of course, King Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth, they had to go and flee to Douai in France, where there's a seminary. That's actually where the Douai Reims comes from. And all these men studying for the priesthood. Why? So they could go back to England and minister underground to the persecuted Catholics there, knowing full well they were facing death. They knew that, and they were going to certain death. I want to highlight the life of one of them, St. Edmund Campion. Many of you know who he is. Wonderful biography by Yves Lenoir, simply called Edmund Campion, A Life. I recommend everyone read it. This was a man who was called a diamond of England because he was an Oxford scholar. He was a well-known orator, incredibly intelligent man. Even Queen Elizabeth, when she came to visit Oxford, was very struck by Edmund Campion. He wasn't a priest at the time. Unfortunately, he did take the oath, the oath of supremacy, essentially denying the headship of the Pope, accepting the Queen as the head of the Church of England. He later on was conscience-stricken over that and rejected it. He fled to Ireland for some time, but then he decided, I need to join the priesthood because his Catholic faith had grown. He goes to Douai, joins the Society of Jesus, comes back in disguise. So he's going all over England in disguise so that he could minister to the persecuted Catholics hiding in these homes. And the Queen put a spy on his trail to try to find him. They finally found him hiding at a little cottage in Lyford Grange near Berkshire in 1581. And he's put in prison, and the Queen herself came to visit him in person and offered him riches and freedom and all of this if he simply renounced his Catholic faith. He refused. And so he was dragged to Tyburn in December of 1581. And by this point, he'd been weakened by torture and all of that, very, very weakened. And as they're passing Newgate Arch, there was a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and he did his best to drag himself up so that he could, give her, homage. And essentially he was hanged, drawn, and quartered. And for those people who don't know what that is, watch Braveheart. Yeah. Watch Braveheart. You're essentially, you're hanged until you're unconscious. You're not dead. Okay, you're just unconscious. Drawing is essentially your hands, your legs are tied, and you are stretched to the breaking point. Many times your shoulders dislocated. It's horrible. And then quartering, essentially you're laid down while you're alive. They disembowel you while you're alive. And he died a heroic death. And Henry Walpole, who was standing there in the crowd at the time, got his doublet stained with the blood of St. Edmund Campion. He went on to become a Jesuit and martyred in the exact same way, in the exact same spot.
And it's almost as horrific as being in Twitter jail for.
Yeah, I want to, because just very quickly, I want to read from what they call Campion's brag. It was a long written appeal by St. Edmund Campion to the Queen Elizabeth, and he dedicated his life to trying to convert her soul and save her soul, as well as many, many Catholics, there. But this is from part of it. It's beautiful, beautiful, but this is what he wrote. Many innocent hands are lifted up to heaven for you daily by those English students whose posterity shall never die, which beyond seas, gathering virtue and sufficient knowledge for the purpose, are determined never to give you over, but either to win you heaven or to die upon your pikes. And touching our society, meaning the Jesuits, be it known to you that we have made a league, all the Jesuits in the world, whose succession and multitude must overreach all the practice of England. Cheerfully to carry the cross you shall lay upon us, and never to despair your recovery, while we have a man left to enjoy your Tyburn, or to be racked with your torments, or consumed with your prisons. The expense is reckoned, the enterprise is begun. It is of God, it cannot be withstood. So the faith was planted, so it must be restored. And he died for his faith.
100 years later, they come to America, the North American martyrs. They were beat, their fingers gnawed off, tortured. Up there in Arsville, in New York, I've been there several times. And St. Isaac Jogues and John de Brebeuf, these guys were just heroic, and they would actually, they broke away from the Indians there, and he had to, Isaac Jogues had to get permission to say Mass, right, because his fingers are gnawed off, and he comes back to the very Indians that were the natives who actually did this to him and trying to catechize them again, and they wind up being martyrs. So these guys really, really understood what love of not only enemies, but love of these people who they're trying to bring to Christ. Yeah. And it so flies in the face of what the Jesuits are about today, of this radical enculturation, which is just baptize any pagan thing that you can find and say everybody's okay and this is just many roads to heaven, you know. Just completely flies in the face of that, what all these people died for.
It does. It's interesting to bring up the question of the North American martyrs, Brebeuf and Isaac Jogues. On the subject of like baptizing pagan things, I think this is kind of it's a really good little point. There is a great piece of music that you can find on YouTube called the Huron Carol. Now the Huron are that's the name for one of the tribes of Native Americans in this part of the world. That's why there is Lake Huron, and there's a lot of things around here who are called Huron or Wendat and Wyandotte, which was a variant of that name. And anyway, the Huron Carol is a beautiful carol about the nativity of Jesus that was written by one of the martyrs, either Jogues or de Brebeuf. I think it was de Brebeuf. And it's absolutely beautiful. And it is written in French and in English and in the Iroquoian language, the language of the Iroquois. And when you actually look at the translation, it's talking about how it's not three wise men came from the east, it was three great chieftains came from the east, putting it within the context that these people would understand, that Jesus is not born in a stable, because they really had no concept of such a thing. Jesus is born in this primitive lodge of bark, which is very absolutely, and it's one of my favorite carols. I listen to it every Christmas. It's absolutely beautiful. But that is a baptism of something pagan. That is saying, okay, and it's their musical style, it's their language, it's their cultural touchstones to say, okay, we're going to take this, we're going to baptize it. Other Jesuits went to the Far East, and they would dress as the Mandarins, as the superior people of that culture, in order to get themselves into the culture, that they would represent Christian concepts in ways that people could understand. Absolutely wonderful. That is a genuine baptism of something pagan. We're going to make it good. Now what's happening is that the Jesuits are taking this and they're bringing it in, and they're not doing anything with it. They're not saying, how can I correctly present this in a Christian way? They're not even filing the serial numbers off. They're just bringing it in and just go, oh, we'll just stick this alongside that. And that is the problem, that there's been a complete loss, I think, of the centrality of Christ to that. That all of the notions of like, okay, your primitive person, your poor person would be born in a lodge of bark. That is where he would be born. Okay, well, we'll say that. Now what they're doing with so much of this, like, it's kind of, obviously not, the Jesuits are not, connected directly with the Pachamama thing, but it's that similar sort of idea of, oh, we'll just bring it in. Just bring it in, not even file off the serial numbers, just stick it up there on the altar and we're good. And that's the problem. They've lost the centrality of Christ crucified.
Well, you have culture, which is what the original Jesuits baptized. There's baptizing culture, and what they've been doing recently, especially in the education field, is trying to baptize evil. And that's something different altogether. Is they're trying to bring, like, transgenderism isn't culture. It's sin. It's messed up human nature that needs, to be fixed, both spiritually and psychologically, emotionally, all that stuff. But to just say, like Father Martin is fond of doing, you were born that way. What does it say? You are fearfully and beautifully made. They like to say that. It's like, which means you were born that way, which is insulting to those people, most of those people who were, molested, raped, all sorts of terrible home lives that led to this crack that, helped push them in the direction of homosexuality and transgenderism. Baptizing that's not what Saint Francis Xavier did. If you think about in the breviary, we do morning prayers, but there's the morning office, the divine office in the morning, with the office of readings. That's what it is. And they have, for the second reading, they have St. Francis Xavier, basically a letter to the Catholic elites, the university, heads and everything in France and all that, saying, I'm up all day. I do Mass, I come back from Mass, and kids are, I eat, and then kids are knocking at my door. They want catechism. People here are going to hell. There's not enough people catechizing them. But you people are wasting your time on dumb arguments over there, going back and forth. Come over here, help me, save souls. People are going to hell, and you're not helping me.
Yeah, he was talking about the anonymous Christian at the time, because that was like, well, these people are innocent and they're going to probably go to heaven. He's like, well, no. These people know what sin is, they're committing sin, and they are going to hell because you people aren't over here catechizing and baptizing them and sanctifying them. So that whole argument about the anonymous Christian was going on long before Karl Rahner
came and did it recently.
But now one could say that about the Jesuits themselves. These people are crying out. They're dying spiritually and physically from their sins, and you're not helping them.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking about the North American martyrs. I just go back to that. Another example of incredibly courageous heroic men. But, when I think of the Jesuits, Satan, what he loves to do is he takes the most beautiful jewels of our Catholic faith, and he does everything he can to twist, pervert, distort, and just, bring it down into the mud and destroy it. And I think he's done that really well with the Jesuits. Saint Jean de Brébeuf, what's interesting is if you read his diary entries, his journal entries shortly before he's martyred, he actually says, I am filled with a burning desire to suffer every single agony torment for these Native American peoples. I want to, give everything to God just to save their souls. And God granted him his wish, and he died a horrible. Oh my God! It's demonic what happened. What they did.
The one who was slowly cooked to death. They lowered him over a fire.
They did lots of different things to him. On entering the village, he and his companions were met with a shower of stones, beaten with clubs, tied to the post to be burned to death. Brébeuf kissed the stake to which he was bound. A fire was lighted under them. Their bodies were also slashed with knives. Brébeuf had scalding water poured on his head in mockery of baptism. A collar of red-hot tomahawk heads placed around his neck. A red-hot iron thrust down his throat. Then when he died, they cut out his heart and they ate it. But they said throughout he never uttered a groan.
Well, that's why they ate his heart. They ate his heart because it's within the American cannibal cultures, to eat an individual's heart was to assume their spirit, to assume their strength. And of course, they saw this man who endured all this tortures,
and some of them actually ended up being converted.
And I think, look, what you have here with so much of this, and I was talking with Dave Nussman, who's the producer of the download here, and we were talking about this particular topic before we said, and I said, one of the things I want to discuss about is the Jesuits, from their inception, they were very much focused on intellectual pursuits filtered through a warrior spirit. Obviously, St. Ignatius himself was a great warrior. He actually had his kind of reversion because he was laid up with some wound.
He got part of his leg blown off.
He got part of his leg blown off by a cannon. Because this was back in the day when that was like a thing that happened. Anyway, and so he was laid up and he was reading the Bible, and he resolved, I think, to copy the Gospels out, and he wrote the words of Jesus in red and the words of Our Lady in blue, and did this very beautiful piece of calligraphy and so forth. But he was much inspired to turn his life around. But he was a warrior. He was a warrior, and he turned his life around. There's this great intellectual tradition of the Jesuits, which is why, of course, they're so involved in education, that has been filtered through this warrior spirit. What they lacked was they lacked their own unique kind of liturgical and devotional life. Many of the other orders, such as the Franciscans, all the different brands of Franciscans, the Dominicans, all of these people, the Benedictines, all these people, they had their own liturgical and devotional life. The Jesuits did not. In order to minister to people with this evangelization and this catechesis, the Jesuits would go very much into the world. Jesuits would traditionally not have a habit. Jesuits would dress like however a priest in that area dressed, and so they were very much within the world, within the diocesan priesthood. When the liturgical train wreck happened after Vatican II, and this is not to say the Novus Ordo itself is a train wreck, but rather the complete freedom to do whatever you like, which is kind of within that. It's, hey, say these words, all suitable words, so you can just make it up. When the devotional life sort of again hit a bit of a train wreck at kind of the same time, the Jesuits did not have that anchor of a devotional life or a liturgy that many of the other orders did. And so the Jesuits suffered just like the diocesan priesthood did without that thing. And I think that's probably one reason, for why.
One of the things to dovetail on that is the enculturation. That's why they were so effective as missionaries. 150 years after being North American martyrs, they were actually into the northwest part of the United States, and that whole part of the country was the black robes were there. The brown robes down the Franciscans were in the southern part. And they did great work with the Native Americans. Many different tribes were warring and killing each other and all this. So it was a very hostile environment to live in. Very difficult. You have bears that will eat you, and mountain lions will eat you, and mosquitoes that will eat you. And it's very difficult. So they had the warrior spirit and the tenacity, and they were real men. But that enculturation. So fast forward that to when things were all getting blurred in the last 50, 60 years. And always reaching out to, well, we can, adapt that or accommodate that or this and that. And that whole mentality, and it's just so easily to get caught up in that and say, wait a minute, are we baptizing evil here? Are we actually assimilating something that we ought not? Is there a way that you can baptize the LGBT community without trying to catechize them or trying to, assimilate them into the ideals of the Ten Commandments, like all of us have to be? So I think they were susceptible, I think, along that line, because it was such an effort historically to that enculturation, which made them really effective in missionary work.
Well, they were among the earliest of the liturgical innovators. So, people want to say in the 60s things went crazy. Well, things went crazy liturgically with the Jesuits in the 20s already. They were doing Mass facing the people, they were doing Mass in vernacular, they were doing things, and all of this was done without permission of Rome. So they were going rogue in doing that. It'd be different if they were, petitioned Rome and said, well, we'd like to, because they were part of the liturgical movement, which started out good, but then it got kind of taken over in like 1914 and kind of went really crazy after that. And the Jesuits were a big proponent of that. And all of this stuff that was done, was done without permission, without anybody being asked. And that's, I don't know, you can't do that and not have some sort of spiritual repercussions. There's a rebellion there. If they had a whole history of they're the Pope's men, they, the church, salvation, whatever, and then, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, they're kind of doing their own thing liturgically with the Mass, which is the greatest Catholic thing, as you were saying. It's the best thing like ever in the world. That's not good. And so I think that kind of paves the way to what we see of the Jesuits today, a doctrinal rebellion. I mean, any Jesuit university, you see them, they won't say they're a Catholic school, they say they're a school in the Jesuit tradition, whatever that means, because I think they know very well they're so outside of the fray on doctrinal stuff, they can't call themselves the Catholic school. There was a high school or something, St. Louis, I think, a couple of years ago. I think it was named after St. John Brebeuf. And they fired a teacher, and the bishop took away their Catholic title and all this other stuff. And they went back and forth, and the Vatican intervened and everything like that. But The Jesuits are a problem, and they were actually suppressed in 1773. Now, maybe the reason for their suppression wasn't the greatest, because they had become so influential. They had become such a mouthpiece for the Pope and the Church. Kings and political people at the time thought, well, they have too much influence in my court, so we need to shut them down. So various, kingdoms petitioned the Pope, if you don't shut the Jesuits down, we're leaving the church. So the Pope, who was a Franciscan Pope, Clement
XIV.
The 14th, petitioned that they be shuttered, and they were for
41 years.
Yeah.
I think it's important to realize that at that sort of period, within that 18th century period, that this is not a long time in terms of the church after the Protestant revolt, when whole countries had left the church. You're looking at just a couple hundred years, which obviously seems to us like quite a long time, but to the church that really isn't very, very long at all. And yet you would have the situation where the church was much more embedded within the government, within the state at that point. And so, the Jesuits did have this outsized influence at that point as advisors to courts and all these kind of things. But you would also have Kim saying, okay, well, we resent the Pope's influence in here. And the Pope just wasn't some dude within like 1 square mile in Rome. No. He had like holdings. He was a powerful prince.
He was a monarch.
His own right. Yeah, but he wasn't just a monarch of this one little thing. Interesting. Let's talk about, just like total sideline, but I just think this is absolutely fascinating. You and Christine were talking about the Jesuits who went to the Far East and so forth. So here's a great little story about the education level of the Jesuits. We have this vision, of course, of the Chinese always been very much into astronomy and astrology and knowing the movements of the planets and the stars and all of this kind of thing. Well, there is a very famous story of an emperor of China asking his court astronomers, when and for how long will the next solar eclipse be? And they gave him an answer. And he was like, okay, very good. And it was due to come very soon. They knew it was due to come soon. It's like, okay, precisely when, which day, how long, etc., etc. Then he asked the Jesuits, who were there as missionaries, and the Jesuits gave an answer, and the Jesuits gave a slightly different answer. It's like, occurred at a different time, different length. And then they said, okay, says the Emperor of China, we shall wait, and whoever is wrong, we will put to death. So the Jesuits did not get killed. The court astronomers got killed because the court astronomers of China did not know, and these Jesuits did. They had this knowledge of that. I just think that's just like a wonderful little thing of just like how expert the Jesuits are in so many different fields, how intellectually knowledgeable these guys. I mean, these Jesuits, it's like, dude, I came here to talk about Jesus and you're asking me about stars and stuff. And it's like, literally, this guy owns a telescope. I borrow one. I mean, it was literally that kind of thing. And it's like, no, but we know more than the court astronomers of China. So they are.
Like listening to a YouTube video of Father Chad Ripperger. It's like,
no, he's brilliant, man.
It's off the charts.
Another historical Jesuit figure I wanted to highlight, very, very important, was Father Claude de la Colombière. He was instrumental in propagating the Sacred Heart devotion, which is probably the most famous Christological devotion in the world right now. I love the Sacred Heart devotion, but of course we know that visions first came to St. Margaret Mary Alacoque with our Lord, with his heart on fire outside of his chest, which denotes, of course, his incredible, intense, all-consuming love for mankind. And so, but she was essentially treated as a hysteric by fellow nuns. They gossiped about her. I mean, anybody who idealizes religious life, like, oh, it would just be so nice to go and retreat into this world, this cloister world, be so peaceful, and I could get away from my family. It's like, no. Read about any life of any saintly nun, and you will know that's not the case at all. St. Margaret Mary Alacoque was treated horribly by her fellow sisters. They all looked down on her. They thought she was having these hallucinations. She was making things up, and it wasn't until Father de Colombière came and became her spiritual director. He was the first one to really believe her. He was the first one to say, no, these are not visions from the devil. You're not a hysteric. I want you to write these down and put them. So in obedience, she did. And he was instrumental because he believed her, with his wisdom, his understanding, in propagating the Sacred Heart devotion. He was actually, what's interesting is he was actually implicated in the Titus Oates plot in England, it was this plot that was made up by Titus Oates, who hated the Catholics, and he fabricated this claim that the Jesuits wanted to assassinate King Charles II. It was a complete and total lie, but like 15 innocent men were actually killed in the process. Father Colombier was put in prison for 3 weeks because he's a Jesuit, and it turned out to be completely false.
Yeah, the Titus Oates plot, that is, oh man, if you've got like an afternoon and you just want to like lose the afternoon and like be just shocked and surprised and laugh because it is just so blatantly ridiculous. Seriously, yeah, just read up about the Titus Oates plot. There are a bunch of like good videos on YouTube about it. No, that's like a classic thing. But what it is, interestingly, the Titus Oates plot managed to get its claws into people, and people in the court were believing it and passing it around and all these things because of this notion that the Jesuits, as the Pope's men, that they were like this sort of super secret assassin force. And of course, you still see it today, with people that obviously there's like pop culture and stuff, and they have like, if you ever want kind of like can I say this? A badass priest? Can I say that? Are they gonna bleep that out? If you ever want a badass priest in a piece of fiction, he's always a Jesuit. He's always a Jesuit, and he's got like, a solid 5 o'clock shadow, and he sits there and he probably smokes and he drinks.
It's like Gregory Peck.
That's right. Yeah, it's that whole hard bit and tall, dark, and handsome thing. But he's a Jesuit, and he's the guy who's going to go out. And, if it's some sort of sci-fi thing, he's the guy who's going to go out and hunt the vampires and stuff. Or if it's like a historical thing, he's the thing. Fighting against the evil. Atheists or demonologists or whatever. But there is this vision out there within the Protestant community of the Jesuits. So if you actually go into certain of the more darker corners of the internet with these wackadoodle Protestants who are convinced that the Catholic Church is pagan and satanic and so forth, this portrayal of the Jesuits as the power behind the throne, as this dark special forces, assassin, spy kind of thing. I think Jack Chick, God rest his soul, Jack Chick was very famous for doing a lot of this anti-Catholic stuff. He produced those little pamphlets that I'm sure you've seen, and a lot of those were very much anti-Jesuit at this point. There was a whole story that he made up, or rather was given to him by somebody, sort of a modern-day Titus Oates. The guy's name was Riviera, I believe, and he made up all of these like crazy stories about Jesuit assassination squads and all of the, and Jack Chick just republished them. So there is this whole thing within there about this anti-Jesuit thing.
Were they featured in the Da Vinci Code?
I think that's Opus Dei in the Da Vinci Code. Surprisingly enough, it's the only time that it's not the Jesuits, but everywhere else is the Jesuits. Actually read into the congressional record of the United States of America, because somebody handed it to his representative and he read it, is the Jesuit oath, which is a flat lie. It's not the Jesuit oath. It is a kind of bastardized and changed version of the Knights of Columbus oath, but with all of this stuff added in, of all of like this bloodthirsty, blood-curdling sort of idea of I will take babies and smash their heads against a thing for the Pope. And it's like, okay, the Jesuits are not like that, and they have never been like that, but they don't even have that kind of zeal anymore.
I don't think Father James Martin lives up to that idea.
He doesn't, no, he's not.
Falls short on that.
Lisping and sashaying around is about all they do.
But Rodney, you were talking about how the Jesuits started to go off the rails in the 20s, and that's very interesting because they all say in the TLM Mass, I mean, not to bang on that or anything, but that was when everybody wore the cassock and the, and all the trappings were right. And to punctuate that, the Jesuits also helped theology go off the rails. And there was two prominent individuals, Karl Rahner was one of probably the chief in that. When I was studying theology with Father Milady, a Dominican, and it was his opinion, and he's so read, versed, immersed in, and knows everything about everything. And he said it was his opinion that Karl Rahner was the linchpin to understanding the whole modernism, the modernistic theology, and all of the modern errors in theology. And just to give you an example, just one little flavor of Karl Rahner, he would not want to talk about nature and grace. You know, this whole pantheism and where all these kind of emanations from God and stuff. They knew how to kind of withdraw from that to a certain degree. But he would prescind from making the distinction between grace and nature. And so, and they would invent their own language. And he was a German, so they would write in this massively convoluted ways and put a verb at the very end and let you try to figure all this out. His brother, Hugo Rahner, was a good Catholic priest, and he said if I had another whole lifetime, you know, I'd spend it just translating my brother into good German, you know. But anyway, the one term, just as a flavor of this, where you'd have a soul in the state of grace. Wouldn't talk about grace, wouldn't talk about nature. He would say that's a supernatural existential. You mean a soul in the state of grace? Well, you can't talk about a soul in a state of grace. You have to talk about graced nature, supernatural existential. And this is the type of mentality, and you're kind of like, huh, with all of this. And Michael Voris also, they had to read Rahner in the seminary. And the massive convoluted ways and the new terminology and the way all this is fabricated, you couldn't tell what ends is up with this type of stuff. And so that's part. Another Jesuit, very famous, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, was in the 30s, and he was in these teams that went to China, and they were into finding up bodies. So one of the great hoaxes that he was tied to was the Piltdown Man. And the British museums later, after all this was written up, oh, we found the missing link and all this type of stuff. Teilhard de Chardin's like, yeah. Very much immersed in evolution, so much so we're all evolving into Omega Point, you know. You mean we're all developing, putting on a Christ-like, virtues? No, we're evolving into God. It is this just caught up in pantheism is what it is. But anyway, the British Museum said you're Piltdown Man, 20 years after that, it was all hyped. Well, that was actually a human skull and jaw of an gargantuan, and chemically stained to indicate great age. The teeth were filed to resemble human, and a little tiny retraction in some journal somewhere, 20 years later without any fanfare.
Well, the Piltdown Man, of course, was fascinating because it was this great hoax that was put out there in order to
for years,
in order to get some clout. That was basically what it was, because everyone was like desperately searching for this sort of stuff. And there was a lot of wanting to search for the missing link, which was the link between apes and humans, and there was this whole idea of that. And regardless of what you believe about evolution and the origin of man, the descent of species, and all this kind of stuff, the whole notion of everyone was looking for this fossil that would do that. And so, as you say, they faked it by taking a human skull and the mandible of an orangutan, which of course gives this notion of like, such a creature has both ape-like and human characteristics. And yeah, as you say, for 20 years or so it was there, but there were multiple other skulls and fossils and so forth that were discovered in that period that were dismissed because they did not fit with Piltdown Man. So that actually our ability to actually look at the fossil record was compromised by this numpty, not necessarily de Chardin, who didn't do it himself personally.
He wasn't very good in theology either.
No, but I mean the fact that he was, all of the people who did this, you go along and you do that, it's like the person who calls up and pretends to be the Unabomber. Okay, well, so we don't catch Ted Kaczynski because some numpty is calling up and pretending to be the Unabomber. And it's like, okay, so worse things happen. And again, it's this thing. It's like you're mucking around with truth for your own clout.
But the occupational hazard was that they were so learned and so immersed in sciences and all these type of things that they get caught up in all this stuff too. And they were actually a great impediment to good theology and good science. And that was part of the problem in the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years. I mean, this all goes back before Vatican II, though. Rahner was writing before then. Chardin was around, 30s, 40s, 50s. So you have a lot of this stuff going off the rails well before Vatican II. When you really want to say, well, did Vatican II change it all? All of these people were perites and experts, and all their stuff was out there going into the council. And that's where, where did all that come from?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue like the Jesuits were suppressed in 1773 for political reasons, and the Pope didn't want to have mass schism from. I would argue suppress the Jesuits again.
We could do with some more politics.
Yeah, well, I mean, this time it's like they're literally compromising the faith of people. People are going to hell because the Jesuits. People will say, "Oh, I've been to 12 plus years of Jesuit school. I've never heard that of this, like simple Catholic theological thing. Well, of course not. You were never told. They're not teaching the Catholic faith, so they should be suppressed, I think. There's the Father Hardens are. Father Hardin's gone. I was traveling one time, and I won't say where because I don't want to get those Jesuits in trouble, if whatever. But these Jesuits, because they can be pretty, like they live in community and they're an order, but they're kind of allowed a certain amount of autonomy as well. And these were Jesuits at a school, I think a high school, and they were doing the TLM for a parish there or something like that. So if it wasn't for these handful of Jesuits who are promoting the TLM in that area, who are saying it, they wouldn't have it for like 300 miles. So there are good ones. But you never hear from them because they got to keep their heads down. Father Hardin was persecuted by his superiors. He was despised by his fellow Jesuits. I wasn't around for his funeral, but apparently there was funny business at his funeral here in Detroit as well, with the Jesuits saying funny stuff and all this. So they could do with another suppression, and probably a lot of the orders.
Well, I think it's interesting. Look, Brad and I, we did the whole deposit of faith thing from the table here, and you were down there in Washington, Christine. Brad and I repeatedly said, and we've said it again, that it's not the idea of like we're not trying to defund every single individual bishop. Like your bishop, we're trying to take away his money, and so he's got to be out there on the streets. What we're wanting to do is we're wanting to defund the USCCB. Okay, I want to suppress the Jesuits, not each Jesuit priest.
Right.
I don't want to suppress you, Father Bob, or whatever. Probably got a French name because the vast majority of the Jesuits seem to have French names. It's great, and I'm just going to say this, wholly tangential. It's a delight being on the download with Christine when we have anything French, because Christine's French accent is beautiful, and everyone else's here is terrible.
Well,
and I wince.
Canadian,
I know, yours is Canadian French, which is different. But don't want to suppress, you, Father whomever, Father Jean. Don't want to suppress you, if you're doing good work. It's just like your order needs to be suppressed because that's the problem.
That's what happened in 1773. The order was suppressed. Those Jesuits weren't, but they had to go to find another order. So it was actually went to the enrichment, very much so, of many other communities that they had to go to. So the individual priests weren't, banned from being priests or excommunicated or anything like that. But it was you can't be part of this group anymore.
Go live your vows in another community.
Yeah, and that was actually a great, enrichment for many of the other communities at the time.
And we talk about the Jesuits being compromised. I mean, one of the ways in which they've been heavily compromised is through sex abusers in their clergy. And what's interesting is ProPublica compiled a comprehensive list of all the clergy credibly accused in America among all the different religious communities, and by far the largest number come from the Jesuits. Wow. By far. In 2018, the Jesuits published their list of credibly accused clergy, all the provinces. So to their credit, that's a step towards transparency, but it also revealed the incredibly high number of abusers. And just as a side note here, the Jesuits are more transparent about their sex abuse than the SSPX, because to this day, the SSPX refuses to publish a list of credibly accused clergy, in spite of the fact that multiple victims have asked them publish a list, just like everyone else is doing. Why won't you? I've asked them, no response.
Probably most of the speaking about sex abuse and everything, the most notorious ex-Jesuit, Marco Rupnik, there was 25 nuns coming forward after all this starts to come out and said, yeah, he abused me too. Horrific stuff. I mean, threesomes and all sorts of stuff. He's a famous artist. He has millions of dollars. 25 plus women have come forward, most of them religious, saying he sexually abused me. And he was excommunicated he was excommunicated, the CDF excommunicated him, if the Pope would have to sign off on it, to say, okay, you absolved an accomplice, meaning there was a sexual predation going on there. Because you could say, well, accomplice, she must have said yes or whatever, but with the whole Catholic Me Too thing, I mean, there's a whole dimension of power and all that. We don't, So, but anyway, there is a victim, a sexual victim here, an accomplice, who you absolved. So right there we're saying there is one at least confirmed person. Really, all these are alleged and have come forward, need to be vetted. With the Jesuits actually said that they're credible witnesses. These are credible testimony. But there is one that court of canon law said you're guilty here of having one sexual liaison who you absolved in the confessional, and because that's a automatic ipso facto excommunication, you've been excommunicated. well, we hear about all the zero tolerance and everything, and the excommunication's lifted. And the Jesuits then actually don't exclaustrate or boot him out of their own community for violating poverty, because he has millions of dollars as a famous artist. They don't kick him out for chastity, even though the Court of Canon Law said you actually did violate chastity here, because the person you violated with, you absolved. And that's why you're excommunicated. And that was lifted. But they excommunicated him because the Jesuits said, this is so much credible witnessing going on here. You're under basic house arrest. It was the town in Lazio, which is an area in Italy that encompasses Rome, and you can't go out that perimeter, and he did. So they said, oh, well, for disobedience, we're kicking you out of the Jesuits. So now this guy is at large and can seek a bishop and actually function to the degree to what the bishop wants you to function. He's just not a Jesuit now. So when you say, wow, you know, your friend actually is a Jesuit pope and a fellow Jesuit, and they were great, you know, friends for going back for a long time. So, you know, the Jesuits do need a lot of prayers, do need a lot of help. They can still do great things, but man, they have to be reconstituted in that original spirit that started the whole place of St. Ignatius, you know, back in the 1500s, and Xavier carried that torch so well. There has to be some input. So pray for the Jesuits that they get back on track. But
and the Jesuits,
take a lot.
To say the Jesuits need to get back on track, I think it's like if the Jesuits could get back on track to Jesuitism, Jesuitiness, if they could become as Jesuity as they were once. So the Jesuits, of course, they are an order. Famously, they're kind of the last actual order. Everyone else is like a congregation or some such, I believe. And they have, obviously, the traditional 3 vows that they do, which is, you know, poverty, chastity, and obedience, as you referenced. You know, obviously, so poverty, it's like you don't own property, you know, that you don't own anything yourself, the order owns it. Chastity, obviously, you know, you're practicing chastity there is appropriate to your state of life, which for a priest is permanent continence, and of course as well there's the obedience. You will be obedient to you know, the will of the community, the will of the order. But also they have a couple of other kind of things that they take, one of which is this obedience to the Pope. You know, obedience to the Pope, and it's this direct obedience to the Pope. That's why they're known as the Pope's men. But the other one, which I think is absolutely superb, they will not ambition. And again, one of these wonderful, you know, words that we're very familiar with, but within the Catholic context, it means something very specific and different. They do not seek higher office. That's the whole thing. I mean, now, if higher office is offered to them, you know, you're Jesuit, fine, step up and take a swing at it. It doesn't say you can't be a priest, doesn't say you can't be a Monsignor, it doesn't say you can't be Pope, but you don't ambition for the thing. And again, I think those 5 things, you know, poverty, chastity, and obedience, and you know, loyalty to the Pope, and not ambitioning, I think those things, correctly interpreted, are absolutely superb things. I think every priest, I think every layperson, you know, to some degree, obviously not poverty in that sense, but not being attached to you know, material things, you know, an obedience, chastity appropriate to your state of life, obeying the Pope, not ambition, let's have some humility. Again, the Jesuits could be this wonderful model, and they are not.
They're not, no, and they're actually serving to destroy the faith at this point. I mean, we don't have time to get into it now, but I mean, the Jesuit education system in the United States, I mean, biggest Catholic education system by far, and I think that the Jesuits have been #1 in indoctrinating young Catholic students in dissent. You know, all over the place, hundreds, millions of children all over the place over the course of the past century, going to these Jesuit schools and then basically leaving, losing their faith. So
I think we probably do need to do a show on the kind of the Jesuit education octopus, because there are a lot of, obviously you think about the Jesuit colleges and you think, okay, it's the colleges, but actually there's a whole bunch of like schools at younger levels,
high schools
that the Jesuits have got there, and they did it. And yeah, I think that's a subject we should go into, because I think it's very important that people understand kind of what they're dealing with.
Finishing up on a good note, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, he actually, when you talked about he was hit with a cannonball, he was recovering, convalescing, and he had a lot of reading there, and it was either the knights and the chivalry and all that type of stuff, the secular stuff, or the lives of the saints and all this, and he would be reading this and be reading that. And he really loved, because he was, military and everything, loved to read the knights and the chivalry and all that type of stuff. But he started to notice over time how the difference in the discernment, how was he left feeling? And he, even though the intense, pleasure in reading the secular stories, but that left him kind of empty inside afterwards, and the lack of peace and the lack of joy. And then he was reading the lives of the saints and how God was working with these people, and they're instruments of God, and how they're developing and going on. They have a life in heaven and all this, and how that left him with peace and joy and all of that. And he started to notice this drastic difference between the two, and it started to develop his spiritual discernment and developed into the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. So you might want to check those out, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, and that might be something you want to tune into. So thank you very much for joining us for today's episode of The Download. Now please join us as we finish in prayer, begging Our Lady's intercession for our nation and our church. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Salve Regina,
Mater misericordiae, vita dulcedo et spes nostra salve. A te clamamus exules filii Eve. A te suspiramus gementes et flentes, in hac lacrimarum vale. Ea ergo advocata nostra, illos tuos misericordes oculos, ad nos converte, et Iesum benedictum fructum ventris tui, nobis post hoc exilium ostende, o clemens, o pia, o dulcis Virgo Maria. Amen.
In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you again for joining us for The Download. We premiere a new episode like this every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. From all of us here at Church Militant, God bless you.